What is up, you savages? This is the Protect Your Neck podcast. I'm your host, Dan Tom, analyst whose work you can find over at MMAJunkie.com. And on this here program, the Protect Your Neck podcast, we break down high-level MMA, but we do it in a bit of a different way, especially in the days of today. We don't usually like to timestamp the shows, but yes, it is the year of 2020 where the COVID-19 epidemic is up upon us. Thankfully, this program has other forms of entertainment to lean on, like this here Top 5 show, where I take a guest co-host and we dive back into the history. Today's topic is going to be Top 5 Light Heavyweight Fights. A great topic and a great guest co-host, a first-time guest co-host, a fellow MMA Junkie colleague. He is Simon Head, at Simon Head on Twitter, where you can find him. Simon, what's up, dude?
How's it going, Dan? It's great to be on. Great to be on. And it's a strange world we live in right now. Everybody's stuck indoors, but thankfully things like UFC Fight Pass and all that sort of stuff are our friend in times like this. And we've lent on that pretty heavily as we've put this thing together. So I'm really looking forward to sitting down and talking some fights.
I am as well, man. I am as well. It's always good to have a fellow colleague join me, but more importantly, just somebody that didn't matter where you work for, Simon. We've all wore many hats in our experiences so far, but you're someone I've always respected. Your opinion. You've been at a lot of these shows. Perhaps some of these fights, maybe we've talked about. Maybe you've been at some of those. We'll get into all that and more. So it's always great to have someone that comes from a different perspective, albeit we're covering the same beat, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean you're much more on the sort of analysis side and, breaking stuff down either before the fact or after the fact, whereas I'm maybe more on the reporting side of it. And, I think you need both strands of that. If you want proper coverage, you want full comprehensive coverage, you need both, right? So, I've been there on press row watching some of the craziest fights I've ever seen in my life. And it's a real privilege to be in there and to be up close and personal watching some of that stuff. It absolutely makes the mind boggle to see the fact that they can get through stuff like this. And some of the fights we're going to talk about today are the sort of fights that you sort of watch them back and you think, they have to change these people. These people must be changed as a result of these fights, because to go through the sheer amount of physical and mental trauma that they endure over the course of whether it be 3 fives or 5 fives, it really is what sets these guys apart from almost any other sport on the planet.
I really like that you said the word changed, because I feel like that's going to be a theme for large parts of both our lists, without even looking at your list. Because, by the way, as for if you don't know, as per usual, me or my guest co-host, so today me and Simon, we don't know each other's list here. We're going to find out what they are right along with you. And if you were able to subscribe your list, of course, it's at the PYN Podcast on all social platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and especially Twitter. We will also get to your list when we get to our honorable mentions at the end of the show. But yes, back to the word change, because that seemed to be a theme, which I'll save for when we get to our selections. But maybe it's because this is light heavyweight fights, right, Simon? And they're practically heavyweights who cut weight, let's be honest. I mean, that's the same goes for middleweight. You could make that argument. In other words, these guys hit hard. And so when we're talking about these entertaining fights, there's a good chance these guys could have been changed as far as their career trajectories, and that sample size could support those claims.
Yeah, I mean, you think about some of the great heavyweight boxers down the years and the weights that they used to compete at. Like Muhammad Ali wasn't a hell of a lot more than 210, 215. I mean, a lot of the guys on this list, almost all of them, when they were competing inside the octagon, would have been doing so at well over 210, 220 pounds. By the time they'd actually got up there and they'd rehydrated. They're big guys. They're basically small heavyweights who can cut, as you say. And they're fighting at speed. Some of the bigger heavyweight guys, the action can be a little bit slow. But these light heavyweight guys, especially early on in fights, there's no messing around at all. They are explosive. They're quick. They've got that little turn of foot that perhaps some of the larger heavyweights don't have. And you put power and speed together, and it's a very dangerous combination. And the light heavyweight division over the years hasn't always been given the most shine. Sometimes it's sort of gone through cycles where it's been one of the glamour divisions and then it's kind of been in the doldrums a little bit. But you look back at some of these fights and it really does show you that we've got a collection of some of the most iconic fights in the sport here at 205.
Yeah, and you say power and speed in that mixture, and I guess to just before we get into the topic, just to tie that into something I said previously, as far as, and I always credit Julian Marquez for saying this: middleweights are essentially heavyweights who cut weight, and we've seen even more in modern era, like looking at Antonio Carlos Jr., won the Ultimate Fighter at heavyweight, grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion at heavyweight. Was like a 500 fighter at light heavyweight, ultimately ended up at middleweight. We see a lot of guys that way, and as time progresses, because I'm sure our list will probably run the gamut fairly wide as far as time goes. And so there'll be some history in this episode too, folks. But you'll also see that some of these guys are that guy wasn't always wasn't he? Didn't he fight at middleweight, or didn't this guy eventually go to heavyweight? Yes, there's a lot of that because. Basically, what I'm saying here is it's a very shared divisions when you talk about light heavyweight, middleweight, and heavyweight. There's a lot of guys like that. Vitor Belfort's a guy who competed at all three, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there's these guys are all savages, and as you say, some of them have come down from heavy, or some of them might even be on their way up towards heavy. I can think of one notable name at least who figures on this. I'm sure he figures on both of our lists. Who in the not too distant future may even find himself holding a heavyweight title one day. So, we've got a lot of people on this list who probably competed in more than one weight division. And the other thing to mention, just obviously, you say we haven't consulted on our lists, just as a point of reference or 2 points of reference. The first one, when it came to looking at stuff outside of the UFC and Pride in particular, I've looked at Pride's middleweight division, which is their 205 division, right? So, or 205 as it was at the time. So I've kept everything at the same weight. So everything should make sense. So the fights are their respective equivalents in terms of the actual poundage. So I know, you look at One Championship or some of the Asian promotions, their definition of weight classes is slightly different. But we're talking poundage, or at least on my list, everything on my list, at least as far as I'm aware. Someone will pull me up on it if I've got it wrong. But all of these fights should all be 205ers.
Absolutely, and as people know, that's a great explanation, Simon. And as people know, the lunatics run the asylum here on this podcast, which means we're not hard pressed on rules. In fact, I appreciate unique little takes, hipster takes, as you might call it. In fact, I definitely cross those lines. And let's be honest, we'll get into it. We'll get into it here on our list. But even within the UFC, right, it gets a little hazy. I mean. Lightweight was at 170 at one point, right? And when they finally made it 155, it wasn't called lightweight. It was actually initially called bantamweight before they made it lightweight. Well, it took them about 4 tries because they dissembled the division about 3 times before ever making it stick, and so on and so forth. So weight classes have their own story. That'll touch on the list here. Let's just dive into these weeds, Simon. Would you like to go first with your number 5, or would you like me to kick the party off? We're going to change. We'll probably end up changing to doing a Chinese fire drill halfway through this anyways.
I'll kick it off, and I'll kick it off with the biggest rivalry, I think, in light heavyweight MMA history, and that's Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier, UFC 182. Now, the thing I love about this fight, this is kind of where everything started. This is where the rivalry really did kick off. And the thing that I sort of going back in history and looking at the sort of the lineage of this fight was never supposed to happen, Dan. This was a substitute fight. This was supposed to be Jon Jones, Alexander Gustafsson 2 at UFC 178. Gustafsson blew out his knee. They called up Cormier, and then they had that infamous, I called it the brawl in the MGM Grand Hall, I called it, where they had that infamous press conference and they basically posterized Dave Scholler on the stage, that infamous moment where Dave, who's about the same height as me, about 5'8", 5'9", sort of stood between them with his arms outstretched as if to say, "Yeah, I can stop these guys." No, he couldn't. He ended up falling back through the curtain. Shoes were thrown, punches were thrown, expletives were thrown, and it just set everything up. But then Jones got injured, so the fight got pushed back. And we had it at 182. And at that point, it wasn't a substitute fight anymore. It was the biggest fight probably the UFC could have booked at the time. It was absolutely massive. The anticipation was through the roof. And that night was the night that we saw just why Jon Jones is as good as he is, because at that point, people were talking about him as being the pound for pound number 1. It was him and DJ, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. There was a genuine debate going on at that point. I think that is Jones really the number one guy in the sport. And Cormier was pretty much on paper everything that Jones wasn't. You know, he was that collegiate athlete coming through, squeaky clean. Uh, Everything about him was almost the antithesis of John Jones. They were almost polar opposites. But Cormier was undefeated as a heavyweight, ran through Strikeforce, ended up in the UFC, went undefeated as a heavyweight, then moved down. And then you've got this rivalry that just exploded almost out of nowhere, because Cormier came in bullish, confident, and clearly rubbed Jones up the wrong way. And then it all went from there. But then when the fight started, Dan, and you know, I'm sure you can share your memories of this as well. Cormier had been through, I think he was unbeaten at that point, was running through everybody, making it look easy. I don't think he'd lost a round. He certainly hadn't been taken down. He got taken down in the first 45 seconds of the fight, Dan. Imagine that. You're an two-time Olympic wrestler. You've never been taken down. You've been in there with some of the best heavyweights of your era and gone through them like a hot knife through butter. You've then moved down a weight where you're even bigger and stronger than your opposition, and 45 seconds into your world title fight, you get put on your backside. The mental shock of that happening must have been quite something for DC at that point. And then pretty much from that moment on, I think he caught a kick. Jones caught a kick, or he certainly grabbed a single leg, swept the other leg, took him down. And there obviously were other takedowns after that. But at that point, I think that was the moment really where Jones basically was marking his territory in the cage and saying, I've got this. Everything you've got, I've got a trump card to beat it. And in the end, that's kind of how it played out. It was a super competitive fight, but everything that DC did, as good as it was, Jones just had that little bit extra. He was just that cut above throughout the 5 rounds. And I think all three judges gave it 49-46 for Jones. So maybe not the closest fight on the list that I'm going to give,
right?
But it was the historical significance of the fact that it started the rivalry. It was the fact that Cormier, as a unblemished athlete, going in there and meeting his match and meeting it in the form of a guy who he absolutely detested by the end of it, and then obviously everything that followed since then. And we all know what happened with like UFC 200 and how all that fell apart. And then the rematch and the failed drug test and the no contest. And the fact that even now, when John Jones goes through his personal problems that he's had just this past week, people are still asking Daniel Cormier, you know, almost asking him without asking him to basically shit on him and to go back and dig it all up again. And DC took the high road, which says all you need to know about him as a guy. Yep. But that rivalry for me defines the modern light heavyweight era in mixed martial arts. And that was the fight that started it. The build up was great. The fight was great. And it led on to even bigger things afterwards. So that's my number 5, Dan.
You know, there's no wrong answer when you're touching on this rivalry. If you were to pick one fight or the other, really. And I'm glad you have it because it's not on my list. Not because it doesn't deserve to be. If we were talking about, because it was a great setup that you did, Simon, and also I like that you focused on the takedowns and what those meant. Because if we were talking about top 5 light heavyweight fights you were looking forward to, or forget light heavyweight fights, Simon, if it was top 5 fights you were looking forward to, this would be on the list for me personally. Because I was a big Strikeforce guy, and when everyone was already trying to figure out what was going on with Jones, I was kind of looking over to Strikeforce. You know, I wasn't disregarding the amazing run that John Jones was on, but I was also one of those people that were like, I could see that, you know, the Rampages of the world were being figured out. They were entering their elder years. A lot of these guys were natural middleweights, whether we were talking about Sonnen or Belfort, or they weren't matchups that necessarily were meant to came to be. And then, you know, there was also that frustrating period prior where they were feeding him Matyushenko or even Vera, and I don't mean that as a disrespect to Vera, because I like Vera, and I may or may not touch on him more later. But this, you know, I was looking over to Strikeforce. Now, this prediction didn't age well, Simon, but I initially thought King Mo was going to be the guy. Now, this is early on, by the way, okay? This is before he gets KO backfist, a spinning backfist from Emmanuel Newton, folks. This is way before that. Still didn't age well. Not arguing with that. But because of that not aging well, and also a guy named Daniel Cormier, who was initially a heavyweight, kind of part of the reason why we didn't expect to see this matchup, right, Simon? He starts. Yeah. He comes down to 205, which was talked about. We didn't really think so because of his issues he had weight cutting with wrestling, right? Which is what he was known from coming before MMA. All of a sudden, he's making 205, and like you said, he was just thrashing people. And in my mind, he took the torch from the guys like King Mo or other guys that we were throwing out there. Oh, this guy could beat Jones. Maybe this guy. Glover Teixeira was a guy that we thought could. And that's why that fight is so impressive to me still to this day, Jones versus Teixeira. But I was really looking forward to this fight. And it was a competitive fight. It was a unanimous decision, justifiably so. But just because the decision's unanimous doesn't mean it wasn't competitive. I'm not saying it wasn't close, but competitive. And now I know I'm, playing wordplay and I'm really taking the tweezers and splitting hairs here, but these are fair definitions, and it was a competitive fight. But those takedowns meant so much, especially in the modern era where we're starting to get a better grasp with takedowns. You even hear the broadcast now, like the Annex of the world, these really smart guys. They're like, they're calling the action fair, but they're also educating the audience at the same time, where they're like, he scores the takedown, but he didn't get anything from it. We're now thinking in these terms. Takedowns don't mean as much. However, this wasn't too far removed, the fight you're talking about at 182, Simon. And I can't think of fights where takedowns meant more. Like you said, it was, you kind of did a vague analogy there, which I liked and I agree with, of the pissing contest or a dog marking his territory. And because that's what it was. That sounds hard, a hard description, right? But it's so appropriate. It's so appropriate. That's exactly what it was. Because people like myself who were making the case for Cormier were going, well, say what you will about Jon Jones at range. When it's wrestling time, baby, it's wrestling time. And it wasn't quite wrestling time. In fact, we see one of the best displays of clinch fighting in MMA, period, modern era or otherwise. In that fight, we see Jones shut down Cormier's clinch. He actually forces Cormier to get better in the clinch because of this fight.
Yeah, and we saw that in the rematch as well. The rematch, Cormier was doing a lot better in those close quarters exchanges and was doing very well until he got caught. I thought he was winning the rematch, and then obviously he got clipped, and obviously we know everything that happened after that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I was very much of a similar mind to you. I was of the opinion that range is such an important determining factor in any fight. If you can control the range, then you can control the fight. And if you're the person who's able to control the... I mean, Cormier was always going to have to walk through the fire of Jon Jones's strikes. But Jon Jones has never been a real knockout artist in terms of how he throws his shots. He tends to look for cumulative damage. He doesn't look for one shot haymaker finishes. So Cormier was in a position where I think he probably felt pretty confident going in that he could walk through anything that Jones was throwing at him. I mean, he'd been in there competing at heavyweight against some pretty heavy-handed guys, and he dealt with them all pretty handily. So against a guy with not much of a knockout record in terms of outright punching or even his kicks, I think Cormier would have been pretty confident he could close the distance, get across that bridge, get his hands on Jones, and being, with all of his vast experience as an amateur wrestler competing at the Olympic level, I'm sure he would have thought, okay, if I get there, he's in my wheelhouse now, and then it's Cormier time. And it didn't turn out that way. And then when it didn't turn out that way, I'm not saying he didn't have a plan B, because he kept fighting. He's a heavy-handed guy himself,
right?
But his knockout punch, if you like, in quotation marks, his specialist skill was basically nullified at source. He couldn't do anything with it. So he was almost fighting with one hand tied behind his back, because the one thing that he's been able to impose on every other opponent in his career, which is his will and his wrestling, he didn't have anything for Jones. Jones just had all the answers. And that's why Jones won the fight as not comfortably, but as well as he did.
Absolutely, well said. Let's tie this in, because there was a seed planted earlier, and I looked just now. It actually ties into my number 5. Now, again, Simon, kind of like we talked about, this is your top 5. This is Simon Head's top 5 list. This is Dan Tom's top 5 list, and we'll get to the listeners' top 5 list accordingly. because if we tried to make a top 5 list, not only is it subjective, we would still argue. We would probably be arguing a lot more over the same fights or crossing over, and they would be much more common. And I don't know if the listeners would get a lot from it. So, admittedly, I will be doing probably a slightly different list for our outlet that both me and Simon work for, the MMA Junkie, when I truncate this into a fight vault. Because some people will have my heads for this and many others, but this definitely kind of gives a hint as far as the Shogun Rua selection. Because let's be honest, if you don't have Shogun Rua somewhere in this list for one of his fights, something is probably wrong with you. Now, that said, if you don't have Shogun Rua, don't feel bad, Simon. There's probably defensible. There's a lot to choose from. However, if you do have Shogun Rua, you're probably going to be talking about certain fights that I'm not going to burn because they may be on your list, Simon. And I wanted to use my number 5, which, as you know, listeners know, I'll use my number 5 as kind of a hipster selection to talk about a Shogun fight that doesn't get talked about that often. And it is a war. It is a light heavyweight war. And it is Shogun Rua on UFC on Fox 4 when he fought Brandon Vera. This fight does not get talked about, Simon. I mentioned Brandon Vera with John Jones, and it was supposed to be a matchup of prospects, but the quiet thing from the matchmakers as well as people who were following the sport, and again, this is no disrespect to Brandon Vera, who is notably set out he was going to be the first UFC champ, right? Remember he said I'm going to get titles at heavyweight and light heavyweight, and you know, he had his moments against Tim Sylvia. They gave him his chances, his matchups at heavyweight. Dropped the ball or didn't go his way for one reason or another. He got mounted by Fabricio Verdum, and he always had that held over his head, and that was kind of unfair. It's Fabricio freaking Verdum, I don't think he would have got out of it earlier, even though he was complaining it was an early stoppage. But you had all these hiccups, right? So even by the time Vera fights John Jones, it's like, okay, we get it. It's a matchup of prospects. I'm using air quotes in case you're not watching or subscribing on our YouTube channel. But Brandon, and of course Brandon Vera, you're hoping he's going to give him a good fight. You're like, I was a bigger Jones fan early than I was later, Simon. But I come off very critical of him because I just, I saw the glimpses of what he showed against Stephan Bonner, and I hated the soft hand matchmaking, that they probably could have used for so many other fighters and not this guy who was so great and clearly above his peers. So I was excited. I wanted Brandon Vera to kind of give him something he didn't. We would fast forward. He drops the ball a couple more times. I lose to John Jones. I'm at UFC 125 when he just gets his nose smashed by Thiago Silva. It shows up as a no contest, but he got walloped in that fight, folks. He beats Elliot Marshall. Has a bunch of canceled bouts. Now he meets Shogun Rua for my number 5 selection here at UFC on Fox, and I do the setup not to mischaracterize or take a shot at Brandon Vera, but to put into context, okay? Because if you go back and watch this fight, Simon, or the listeners, you even hear Joe Rogan going, he's kind of like doing subtle jabs, not because Joe Rogan's a dick or he's trying to take shots at Brandon Vera. I think he likes Brandon Vera. Joe Rogan's a great commentator. But you hear him almost kind of taking shots to where, like, Brandon Vera almost gets knocked out in the first round. It almost looks like he's out on his feet. Shogun's just piling it on. Brandon Vera's back's against the head's against the fence. He bends over at a certain point. You're like, oh, it's almost done. And then Brandon Vera just decides somewhere. He's like, you know what? No. I know I've been disappointing for like the majority of the run of my decade or my UFC career, it feels like, and people have given up on me. And by the way, he would never get a UFC win before. He wouldn't get a UFC win that night or after, and he would never fight in the UFC again after one more loss. Okay, folks. But there's a moment where Brandon Vera decides to bite down and swing back, and he makes this a fight. And it gives us a great fight that I feel I can even sneak on this list. But B, back to the Rogan quote. Rogan's going, what? Vera's fighting back. Like, he's almost making comments like he's surprised, like, wow, he's not quitting. You can't say he's quitting. It's like, well, Joe, no one was saying he's quitting. But Joe is essentially acknowledging the hardcore audience and the previous dialogue, right? Not the necessarily casual broadcast dialogue. So it may come off that Joe is being harsh on Vera, but you have to put into context all the hype Vera brought, okay? I mean, this was supposed to be, Vera was talking about champ before this was a thing, all right, folks? So, like, you really have to put into context that Vera was a guy that captured the imagination. I mean, he was a Greco-Roman wrestler who qualified really high here on the U.S. side of things. He was working his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I want to say with Lloyd Irvin through the Alliance connection. He was doing kickboxing with Rob Kamen. And you're seeing all the skills that he would show in flashes throughout his career. Shogun made him show all the skills, the counter grappling, the offensive grappling that people criticize Vera. And Vera was a much better grappler defensively and offensively than he ever got credit for. We see his slick southpaw, southpaw striking. He's hitting elbows that we would see later Anthony Smith. He was actually showing a lot of the seeds from whether it was Gustafsson, Anthony Smith, tall guys with rangy striking, John Jones, all the foils that would later show up in Shogun's game. Brandon Vera showed all those foils. He did not come away with the win. In fact, he tried so hard for the win that he almost, had the tide turned by the time round 3 came around, even though he almost got knocked out in round 1. But by the time round 4 comes around, they're both pretty tired, and Shogun digs deep and connects with him with a brutal shot. Brandon Vera still keeps trying to fight to where he doesn't get just knocked out, Simon. But he gets knocked out bad. Simon, I'm sure, especially cage side, as you've covered many fights, there are certain knockouts that stand out more than others, right? Whether it's the guy going out cold, he does the foot twitch. One of the worst ones, in my opinion, I think James Tahuna suffered it for one of his last knockouts. But when they go unconscious and they come out of conscious and they're going, and making noises, it's the worst. It's so uncomfortable, and Brandon Vera is doing just that. It's one of the most uncomfortable knockouts you see. But at the same time, even though Van de Vera would never get a UFC win, he was already in a down streak. He would never get a UFC win again. You cannot freaking accuse that guy of not trying or quitting. And that is a fight that, for both guys' sake, just does not get talked about enough. There's plenty of Shogun fights that deserve to be on here. I'm not saying they don't, folks. I just wanted to use this opportunity to talk about that one.
Yeah, and Brandon's gone on and done pretty well for himself since then. He's gone over to Asia, where he's one of the big stars in one championship. He's a reigning heavyweight champion. He is, I think, he's 4-1. He's 4-1, undefeated at heavyweight. But he's 4-1, and he's all of his wins have been first round finishes at heavyweight. So he's still got plenty of life in him yet. Even though I think he's in his 40s now. I think he might be in his 40s. Is he 40? 42. There you go. Just a quick check on his age. 42. So yeah, I mean he's moved over and he's done. He's a bit of a legend over there in the Philippines. They love him, and the crowds absolutely adore him when he's fighting over there. They always try and put him on a Filipino card whenever they can. So he's done pretty well for himself over there. I think for him, it was a classic case of getting too much of a push too early. Yeah. I think he got that. I think he picked up that win over Frank Mir. But Frank Mir wasn't at his best at the time.
Yep.
I think he was still fighting his way back at that point. That was back in 2006. But then he lost to Tim Sylvia. He lost to Fabricio Verdum. Then he later lost to Keith Jardine. And the wins that he picked up in the main were against what you would call prospect opposition rather than contender opposition. So yes. Probably the biggest name that he beat was probably Krzysztof Szynski, who at the time I think was considered potentially a rising contender, but it never quite happened for him. And he beat Elliot Marshall, as you mentioned. Yep. But every time he went in there with a world-class opponent in the UFC, he got beat. And that's not a downer on him. Yeah. It might just be that his evolution as a mixed martial artist might have, he might have peaked later in his career. He's been in there, and he certainly looks much more comfortable fighting at heavy than he ever looked fighting at light heavy. He's quite thin and rangy, but at heavyweight, I mean, if you see him at heavyweight, he's a solid unit at heavyweight. He's properly filled out. His other problem, of course, is his prime, if you like, as a UFC light heavyweight was pretty much in that period where the old guard, if you like, your Shogun Huas and people like that, were still pretty much at their prime. And then there were this new crop of rising contenders, led, of course, by John Jones, who was beginning to hit form as well. And it was that sort of sweet spot where you had the new guard and the old guard. And, Brandon couldn't quite break through during that time, where arguably the talent pool at that point has never been any richer than it was at that moment, sort of in the early 2010s, maybe.
Right. Even guys like Keith Jardine, like who you can't really look good against, right? You know,
Yeah.
who he's supposed to beat was a name, but you can't really look good against that guy. And totally, yeah. I don't mean to discredit anything that he's doing at one now, which is awesome. I think I just mean to say that I don't know if he really got a fair shake, which. To your point, the fast push. I don't know if he really got a fair shake or the best representation as far as the U.S. audience or the UFC audience by the time that he left.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I think the thing with the UFC and back then, I think they were doing like a card, 1 or 2 cards a month back then.
Right.
When he was on the way up, people were getting big wins, and the natural thing to do was to rebook them as fast as possible. And get them back in there. And, I think, although I think with someone like Vera, he wasn't able to evolve himself into that upper echelon. He went in there with enough of them, but it just didn't quite work out for him. And as I say, I mean, he started out at heavy, dropped to light heavy. I think, as you say, his plan was win the heavyweight title first, wasn't it? And then drop to light heavy and do it there. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out for him. But Shogun Rua at the time was an absolute killer, and he might feature on my list a bit later on.
All right, good. I'm glad I didn't burn any others. Let's continue to move on the list. Who do you have for your number 4, sir?
Right, let me take you back to 2004. We're gonna roll the clock back a little bit.
All right.
Saitama Super Arena in Japan. Huge crowd in attendance. Pride Critical Countdown 2004. Now, this event featured the quarterfinals of the 2004 Heavyweight Grand Prix. That was the real selling point of Critical Countdown. It was all about the Heavyweight Grand Prix, and Critical Countdown was the quarterfinal stage. So you had like Sergei Karatonov, Semi Schilt, Big Nog, Heath Herring, Kevin Randleman, and some Russian dude called Fedor Emelianenko. I don't know if you've heard of him. Apparently he was quite good. So we had those guys on all in the quarterfinals of Pride Critical Countdown. But also on that card was a light heavyweight bout that possibly, arguably, produced the most famous light heavyweight knockout in MMA history. I think it's got to be up there. Quinton Rampage Jackson knocking out Ricardo Arona with the power bomb felt around the world. Before we talk about the finish, though, Dan, I think it's absolutely vital we make clear just what a savage Ricardo Arona was, right? So heading into that, because to a lot of people who maybe weren't watching or covering the sport at the time, or maybe haven't had the chance to delve that far back into the archives, maybe only know Ricardo Arona as the guy who got slammed into unconsciousness. That does him a huge disservice. He's a 3-time Abu Dhabi champ, including in the absolute division. If you win the absolute division, then you are the man. Heading into the fight with Rampage, he was 8-1 in mixed martial arts. His only loss at that point was against Fedor, who he took the distance. So we're talking about a legit talent. By that time, he'd beaten Jeremy Horn twice. He had a win over openweight king of Pancrase, Guy Mezger. He had a win over Dan Henderson, and we know what he went on to do in his career, Pride Strikeforce champion. And he had a win, I think his most recent win before the Rampage fight was a win over Ninja Hua, who won a championship for Elite XC, who weren't around for too long, but hey, it was a belt. So these are all championship level opponents, and he was he was defeating them. A legit fighter, superb credentials from a grappling standpoint, and he went on after that defeat and did very well for himself as well. Beat Dean Lister, Sakuraba, Vanderlei Silva. He reached the final of the Pride middleweight tournament, which is light heavyweight in our money, right? So this is not a guy who was a scrub or someone who, when he lost, his career was over. He was good before, he was very good after, but against Rampage Jackson, at the time, Rampage Jackson was one of the scariest dudes on the planet. But in that fight, Ricardo Arona was looking to use his grappling advantage. It was an obvious striker versus grappler matchup, and the final exchange was the one that has been replayed tens of millions of times, I would imagine, over the course of the last decade or so. He's got his back on the mat. Rampage is looking to throw some ground and pound, and Arona grabs the arm, locks up the triangle, or he's in the process of locking up the triangle, and I I think he sees Rampage has left his arm in, so he's gone for the arm and he's looking to lock up the triangle armbar, which would have been checkmate. I don't think Rampage would have got out of it, but Rampage made a split-second decision that helped him win the fight. Soon as he saw that Arona was going for his arm, he brought his other arm in and clasped his hands together, and that was the move that allowed him, just with his sheer athleticism and brute strength, to then lift him up above his head and then slam him down onto the mat. Now, you watch the replay. I'm not 100% sure whether it was the back of Arona's head hitting the mat that knocked him out, or the fact that Rampage's forehead went straight into the brow of Arona, literally like a tenth of a second afterwards. So it was almost a double impact. Whichever one it was knocked him out, it knocked him out clean. And it's one of the most devastating finishes. And we've seen it before when people get locked up in an arm bar or a triangle arm bar like that, and the crowd, quite often you see people try and almost replicate this move, try and lift them up and slam their way out of it, and no one's ever been able to reproduce that Rampage finish to quite that level. And for that reason, and the fact that was peak Rampage, that was when Rampage was at his absolute peak. He had the Apollo Creed shorts on at the time, the Apollo Creed shorts, and he was an absolute megastar in Japan at the time, and that was the knockout that really took him up to the next level. And of course, he had those legendary fights with Vanderlei Silva, but for me, that was the peak of Rampage Jackson in Japan.
Totally.
And it's an iconic piece of footage. And we talk about how we compile these lists, Dan, and as you said quite rightly, if we'd have just listed the best, what we consider to be the best 5 fights, our list probably would have been pretty similar.
Right.
So I've gone, my sort of criteria has kind of moved back and forth as I've done this list. So we've got historical stuff, we've got stuff that resonated with me personally, and stuff that I just think absolutely has to be in there just from a sheer action and content standpoint. So, but for this for me was one of the most devastating finishes I've ever seen at light heavyweight. It's iconic, and for that reason, that's my number 4.
Great pick. There's so much you could have picked with Rampage, but I like that you picked this one because, Arona doesn't get talked about enough. Him and guys like Marilla Bustamante around that time period, to those, you see them opposite of your fan favorites like the Vanderleis or the Rampages. But if you look at their body of work, like people often refer to Vinny Magalhaes, still one of the best submission grapplers in MMA, right? They refer to him as he's got the body of like a Greek god, and I don't mean that like erotically or anything, but like he, as far as fighting, right, he's got this great build of muscle and flexibility. And if you're a grappler or a jiu-jitsu guy and you've got that insane balance of musculature and flexibility and athleticism, boy, you can do some damage. And Arona was like Vinny, except a much bigger. You used the word unit, I believe, and it was correct. I mean, it was also a different testing time period. It was a different era of the sport. But yeah, he had that balance, right? And again, he wasn't just a jiu-jitsu guy. This was an Abu Dhabi guy, folks. So that means he could do it in and out of the gi. So having a guy that level, that kind of a force, I mean, this was a legitimate threat. He was probably hoping it would have gone more like Melvin Manhoff versus, what's that Korean gentleman's name? Hoon Sik Kim or whatever. When he lost by armbar, where it's just like you have the super athletic.
It wasn't Min-Soo Kim, was it?
Yes.
Min-Soo Kim?
Yeah. And he's got the super athletic guy bombing on you, and hopefully you catch the submission. That's what happens when it goes right. What happens when it goes wrong is that. Yeah, so that's a great selection for many reasons, Simon. Awesome there. My number 4 is another one kind of like you capped off. The criteria changes. Like this one, if we're judging from a pure fight standpoint for what happens in the fight, how much action we see, etc., this is probably one of the more lower ones on the list. So it is technically lower on the list, but more excusable ones to maybe get off the list. And I thought about it, but both from a personal perspective, for when I was watching this fight where I was, to more for the sport and what it represents for the sport and martial arts, I think it's a very important fight still. So Rashad Evans versus Lyoto Machida at UFC 98. Or 97, I apologize. I'm having a dyslexic moment. Makes my list for a reason, okay? This was I I don't know if you remember watching this one live or not. I watched it live in Vegas, Simon, but not from the arena. I believe it happened at MGM. Okay.
Right.
I watched it at one of the Fertitta properties. The Fertitta's own station casinos, as you guys hear. There's about 4 or so of them, maybe more, maybe less now. I don't know. We'll see where it ends up. But this was at the Green Valley station, probably their newest, probably still to this day the newest one. And they had kind of like a fake like octagon area with like a cage, and they would just set up a big screen, and it was a viewing area where they sell you overpriced drinks, and they charge you a price at the door to watch the fight, essentially. Okay, folks?
Yeah.
This is kind of, this is kind of early internet ripping things. I wasn't a fan of ripping things, by the way. Still not. I'm just saying. You're wondering why didn't you just watch it from home, Dan? Well, this was one of the few fights I went to with my stepdad, and who became a fan of the sport. And this was something that he knew guys like Matt Hughes and Randy Couture, but didn't know much beyond that, right? So he's kind of the casual. I'm a hardcore at this point. We go in, and it's just like your American audience, right? Like, when they're introducing Machida, like everyone in the audience is booing, and where I'm watching. The great part is, as I'm telling you guys my personal story, when you go back to watch this yourself on Fight Pass, or when I would go back to watch it later, the audience reaction and the audience turn, not heel turn is the proper thing, but at a certain point, the audience turns who they're rooting for. But it happened in my audience as well as when you go back and watch the broadcast, the MGM Grand audience. And that's what kind of makes this fight special, because you have a sitting American champion in America, the more reliable face. I mean, Rashad Evans is on a run, folks. Don't judge Rashad Evans off recent history when you're listening to this. Like, Rashad Evans was coming off. His last 2 fights was a knockout at UFC 88 of Chuck Liddell, an iconic knockout that will stand the test of time. And then he knocks out another legend in his own right, an Ultimate Fighter winner, coached by him. He knocks out the master and the student. Forrest Griffin, right? The Ultimate Fighter 1 winner. And he knocks him out for the title because, of course, Forrest just beat Rampage Jackson in another big fight. So Rashad Evans is coming into this thing higher than ever. You got Machida, who's undefeated. Like, the last person to even land a power punch on him was BJ Penn. Like, up until Shogun Hua, who beat, spoiler alert, folks, who beat Lyoto Machida. BJ Penn came the closest to be a lightweight. It was the guy that came the closest to beating Lyoto Machida, which only made him, his aura, his style, a further perplexing product to sell, to fight, to whatever, to get behind as a fan. We didn't quite know what to make, even fans of him, right? But when Lyoto Machida went and he upset Rashad Evans, it's essentially a couple counters. It's not the most action-filled fight until the finish happens, which is a pretty awesome and worth going back to watch. And sure, the welcome to the Machida era, that did not age well, sure. But what it represented was true. Rogan joked about it. He goes, if this Machida guy pulls it off, karate school sales are going back up, because what was going on then, which is still going on now, it still goes on within our sport at the highest levels, people talking about it. People talk about traditional martial arts with almost a disdain. And I get it. Believe me, I'm someone who came from traditional martial arts. So even though part of me will defend it here, I am in no way not going to state the facts. I'm well aware of the facts, hence why I converted and got into Muay Thai, boxing, and then from there I got into jiu-jitsu and grappling. I abandoned. I left all the black belts I learned from other arts, and I said, no, I'm not gonna even fight for my southpaw stance or do anything that I'm normally doing. I'm gonna get my ass kicked, but I'm gonna learn how to box. So believe me, I'm not wrongly defending, but at the same time, I will say that traditional martial arts does get a lot of disrespect, and even till this day. And seeing a guy like Machida kind of come in and just do what he did, and sure, it was kind of figured out, oh, he's waiting to counter. Oh, don't rush in on him. Or attack the legs. How did Muay Thai guys beat karate? And people started looking at other sources. They brought them into MMA. And now we're seeing, Douglas Lima dethrone Michael Page. And, Shogun Hua kind of helped remind us what the blueprint is to beat these guys. But up until then, it was like some mystery, right? And It was just a special snapshot in time. I know this probably not on anybody's list. I'm ranting too long on this fight already. But it was just so cool to see the American audience, both in the broadcast and in the room I was, Simon, to go from booing the stupid karate guy, look at him, what a wimp, or other words that are no longer okay for us to use that maybe me and Simon used as a kid growing up. But they may have been shouting those words at Machida, but by the end they were cheering for him. God damn it, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it did was it was almost like a throwback because you think of how the UFC started. It started out UFC 1, and it was a guy in a gi turning up, and everyone looking at him going, well, this guy's toast. He's going to get absolutely murdered by these guys. And he goes in there, he beats 3 guys in one night, and opens the eyes of the world to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, as I'm sure they would tell us. So it was almost that, but sort of 15 years on, because what Lyoto Machida did, he was one of the very few people fighting the way he did. I mean, for a lot of people watching him fight, the overriding view was this guy's taking a lot of chances. His hands are low, he's bouncing in, and when he does attack, he tends to sort of throw his weight forward and his head's sort of straight up. He's wide open for a counter, and but yet he had this fighting style, and it's almost like witchcraft, you got these other guys who they've been training wrestling their whole life, and they've added sort of boxing to their wrestling, because we sort of went from that era of wrestle boxers, and right. Then you got, and I guess you could argue Rashad came from that era. I mean, he was a very strong wrestler, but he had excellent hands. I mean, you mentioned his knockout of Chuck Liddell. That very nearly made my list, because that is probably my favorite one-punch knockout of all time. Just the sheer speed of it, and the speed, the technique, and the fact that they threw at the same time, and Rashad got there miles ahead of Chuck. So I had a lot of time for Rashad. I know a lot of people thought he was a bit cocky when he first started out, when he came through tough. I know he rubbed a few people up the wrong way. He was a little bit sure of himself. But we've seen since then, and I've had the chance to interview him a few times. He's a top man, really nice guy, very giving of other athletes as well. Check out his Hall of Fame induction last year.
Yeah.
He was on the podium when the earthquake hit, if you remember that.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
We had the earthquake in Las Vegas, and he was in the middle of his speech. So, but for him to get beat the way he did, and he wasn't just beaten, he wasn't just knocked out. He was just dismantled. He was befuddled and then dismantled by Machida, the way he did it. And to do it with, as you say, a traditional martial art, it just gives credence to what his karate schools are still teaching. And it's everything about martial arts is about protecting yourself, and learning techniques to protect yourself. And and I remember when I started Japanese jiu-jitsu, that's what I used to do as a kid. And I remember I think day one, obviously they teach you how to fall. The other thing they taught you was the best defense is not being in the way. If you can not be there, then that's your best defense. If you can get the hell out of dodge, leg it, keep out of trouble, then that's fine. If you're in a cage in a fist fight, that's a bit tricky. So you need to know your footwork. You need to be able to control range, and to be able to do that with a world-class, world champion fighter coming towards you. That's more than just drilling a few katas in the gym. So, that was a big win for karate, a huge win for Lyoto Machida, and for the career he's had, to be able to go down in history, having said I was a UFC world champion, I think, and also he did it all with absolute class as well. No one's got a bad word to say about Lyoto, and rightly so. I mean, the only question mark really against him is the whole drinking his urine thing, which I still haven't quite got my head around that. But you do what keeps you healthy, Lyoto. But the gi I'll take. The urine in a glass, I'll leave that one to you. But
that was more
amazing competitor, and he deserved his win. It was a great win.
Yeah, that was more his father. His father unfortunately passed on that tradition to him, and boy, those things are gonna last. But no, yes, absolutely.
This is not urine, by the way. Just for those who are watching the video, this is very weak orange cordial. Just for reference.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Apropos. No, it was classic, and I like the analogy there. As far as there was a little bit of that, bringing it back to UFC 1 per se. Number 3 here, number 3 on the list. We're in the middle now. I believe it's your turn, Simon. Do you got your number 3 queued up?
I've got my number 3, and it's a fight that I think most people listening to this would expect one or both of us to have on the list.
Okay.
But arguably, controversially, very few people would think that it would come in at number 3. I've got John Jones versus Alex Gustafsson at UFC 165 as my number 3. It's going into the Hall of Fame. It was announced this year. It's going into the UFC Hall of Fame. It is quite rightly held up as one of the greatest title fights in UFC history. Certainly the greatest light heavyweight title fight that I can ever remember. We've had some good ones, but that one, from a technical standpoint and everything about it, I think that is the standard by which all other, certainly light heavyweight title fights are judged. Maybe all title fights in the UFC. It was historic. It was an outstanding matchup, and that's my number 3. I mean, there are a lot of people who, and people are still arguing to this day that Alex Gustafsson won that fight. I scored the fight for John Jones. I thought John Jones won the fight, and having watched it back on more than one occasion, I haven't seen anything to change my mind on that. But what we did see was Jones getting pushed, and we mentioned earlier Daniel Cormier doing very well against John Jones in the rematch before getting head kicked. But over the full course, over the full 5-round distance, nobody has given John Jones more trouble than Alex Gustafsson. Everything that Jones did well, Gustafsson did well, and I think that came as a bit of a surprise. Gustafsson came into the UFC predominantly known as a striker. Came in with a boxing/kickboxing background. Not really heralded for his grappling credentials or his wrestling, but he clearly had worked incredibly hard. No doubt with a lot of help from Ilir Latifi, who was in his team throughout all of this run into the UFC, who is a very strong wrestler. And I think it came as a bit of a shock that Alex was able, especially after what we saw Jones do with Daniel Cormier, and a 2-time Olympic wrestler, for someone like Gustafsson, who doesn't have those wrestling credentials, to go in there and hang, well, not just hang with Jones, he was taking Jones down. And that was, we talked about the impact and, like the sort of the wow moment of Jones taking DC down. We had that again, but in reverse with Gustafsson taking Jones to the mat.
Yep.
That was at that point, it was like, okay, we've got ourselves a proper fight here. Because the one area where we thought, well, Jones has always got this to lean back on if he's getting lit up in the striking, or it's not going his way in the stand-up. We know Jones can get the fight to the mat and probably be quite dominant. But then Gus starts taking Jones down, and it's like, okay, all bets are off. This is up for grabs at this point. And few people saw it coming. What you tend to find is when, talking about people who thought that Gustafsson won, and there are still people now who will still argue that. What you tend to find is when you've got a dominant champion, especially when it's a champion that perhaps hasn't become universally popular, and Jones certainly hasn't been universally popular. He's very polarizing. What you find is when you've got a champion like that and they've been in post for a while, a lot of people are tuning in to watch him lose, in the hope that that next challenger is the guy who's finally going to knock him off his perch and defeat him. So what you tend to find is people are automatically carrying bias into the fight, and they're watching the fight through the eyes of how well is Alex Gustafsson doing here. And then you've got the commentary from the guys in the booth, and quite rightly highlighting the fact that Gus is doing the business and having success where few people thought he was. And I think that just then bumps up everything that Gus is doing by an extra few percent. And then what happens is you get to the end of the fight, all these people are watching it kind of through the eyes of a challenger, think, well, Gus has done enough to win this fight. But of course, judges don't look at fights like that. It's red corner versus blue corner, and it's completely dispassionate, and it's what's this person doing versus what's this person doing, effectiveness of this versus effectiveness of that. And it's like for like, comparing and watching the fight back. If you can do that without, in fact, it's probably easier to do that now. The result has happened. You
just go back, watch
it and say, okay, how will we score this now? And you look at, obviously the scoring criteria has tweaked slightly since then, but I think looking at the fight, and I haven't watched that fight back and thought that Gus won. What I have done is watch that fight back and thought he came very, very close. And I think in the end, it was the final round. I remember scoring it at the time, 48-47 for Jones. And I think two of the judges that night also scored it 48-47 for Jones. The third gave it 49-46.
Yep.
But for me, it was the final round. It was very close going into the final round, and Jones won that final round, at least in my eyes, and that for me was what won him the fight. And Gus pushed him harder than anybody we've seen before or since over the full 5-round distance. As we say, DC did well before he got KO'd, but that was a no contest. But I think this one fight here is the one that cracked open the door just a little bit to say that this seemingly indestructible pound-for-pound star, he can be beaten. We've seen how close Alex Gustafsson got. It just needs someone to go in and basically do that plus 5%, and you've got a new champion. And I think that's why this fight, aside from the fact it was just a great fight, that's why this fight goes on the list for me.
This fight was the Predator moment, right, Simon? If it bleeds, we can kill it. When they find the blood on the branch, that was the Gustafsson fight. We're holding the leaf up. We're showing our friends, look what can be done. But like you beautifully described, that bias, that challenger bias, that dominant champion bias, however you want to call it, there is a bias there. That's probably why I lean toward Gustafsson live. I've scored it for Jones 48, 47 since. All the rewatches, right? However, it's ironic because first, let me just touch off. I don't hate it on being number 3. I wrote honorable mention /2 because it's probably going to fall number 2 or 3 when I do the truncated version on Fightful. I feel like people would have my head if I didn't have it on there, and I feel like it does deserve to be on there for me personally because, again, in hindsight, it's much easier to score. That being said, it probably impacts us a lot less than when we were in the moment and we were excited. Could John Jones actually lose? Oh my God. There is a lot of that, and I think some distractors will say, and I'll give them their say later. There's some notes here for the listener list. But just for people that might say, this fight's overrated, they may point to that example as per their argument that we're blowing this fight up because it was the greatest fighter, and this was the time where he almost lost. This was the first time where he almost lost, right? Et cetera, et cetera. However, I would say that, like, for example, and I love both these fighters for different reasons, Tim Elliott versus Demetrius Johnson. I believe that's a great example for what you're talking about because we think of that fight as like Tim Elliott gave Demetrius Johnson a run for his money. And if you look at it, whether it's what people like the professionals or people like myself think the odds should be, or whether it was Tim Elliott's odd history, it didn't match up after that Demetrius Johnson fight. Tim Elliott was not just the favorite in maybe fights he maybe shouldn't have been favored in, and that's no disrespect to him, but you get that bump after you fight the champion and you don't get finished, right? Even if you lose. Like, remember Dan Hardy? After he was riding high because he didn't get submitted by George St. Pierre, but then he gets knocked out by a one-punch knockout against a guy who really doesn't one-punch knockout people in Carlos Condit. Now, no disrespect to either of those guys, obviously, but I'm just saying there is a little bit of this bias, this kind of push you get. And if you go back and watch the Tim Elliott versus Demetrius Johnson fight, it's really only one front headlock catch in the first round, and none of the other rounds are close. But to your point, Simon, we build it up in our heads because Tim Elliott has these crazy moment in the first round, and we're like, whoa, we completely underestimated this guy, just like we all did Gus, right? And he's proving us wrong already in the first round. Back to your point about the takedown and why that was so big. And we're like, whoa, right? That being said, I believe it was a much closer fight, and by quality, a much better fight, and by importance, because there's all these different metrics we can judge these fights or justify these fights on their list. All those metrics, I think John Jones versus Gustafsson is much better than that fight, is all I would say, I guess, to that argument. However, it's not like a number 1 for me either, Simon. It would probably be a number 2 or 3 for that same reason. And just lastly, how I scored it for whatever it's worth, I think it came down to the 5th round as well, and I do score it for John Jones. I just think it's ironic because I think that there is an argument for Gustafsson in the 5th because what John Jones does so well, and that Jackson camp really made they really started the trend. Not just the takedown with the last 10 seconds, which thankfully we're seeing judges smarten up, right? We're realizing it doesn't win the round. But the Jackson camp was one of the first ones to do that. But they didn't just do it through takedowns. They would do it through punches and kicks. And they would do it, especially Jones, someone as dynamic as Jones, would do it by spamming moves. So whether they landed or not, he would always spam spin kicks and spin elbows. And he would do some kind of weird stalking, even if he was countering and being conservative the whole round. Because, again, they're smart over there at that Jackson Wink, especially in that era. They were consistent round winners. They had the judge's perspective in mind. Now, luckily, it pays off for him in round 4 because he rocks him with the spinning elbow. He legitimately rocks Gustafsson. We're not arguing with it. I don't hate judges for giving him that round. On rewatch, I've given John Jones that round either. It's just ironic because literally 4 minutes to 4 minutes and 15 seconds of the round, not only is Gustafsson clearly winning the round, again, clearly winning 4 minutes to 4 minutes and 15 seconds of a 5-minute round. But he is busting up John Jones, who is already busted up by this point of the fight in round 4. He busts up John Jones arguably more, puts more numbers on him maybe even too than any other round. And that's ironic that is the turning point, which should be too late if we're judging by round 4. And he won the majority of that round. When you start doing that kind of crude math, you're like, how the F did Gustafsson lose the fight? But he loses round 3. He gets round 4 stolen from him. And, not by a wide margin, but John Jones does enough to outwork him in round 5. The ironic part, though, about round 5 is, again, I score it for Jones, no issue. But if you look at it, he's not even landing any of the strikes that he's spamming at the end of round 5. And even at the end of round 4, he legitimately hurts Gustafsson. But there's like 20 seconds left in the round, and he literally hits him with 1.5 to 2.5 strikes. None of the other follow-up strikes land. So even though I scored it for Jones every time, I'm not surprised when I still hear people hanging on to the Gustafsson argument. But they got to take into account what you said, because I completely agree, Simon. Jones is so built up that this really just took us off by surprise and biased our view for better and worse.
Yeah, and I think the thing with John Jones, I mean, one of the things that maybe he doesn't always get a huge amount of credit for, largely because it's not necessarily something that the fight game likes to hold up as a virtue, is he's probably the best game manager in MMA. Like he knows his status at any point in any round in any fight. Yep. He knows when he's behind. He knows when he needs to turn it up. He knows when he needs to keep his distance. He's just got his fight IQ is up there with anybody who's ever been in the cage. And I think, yeah, technically he is an outstanding fighter, but marry that with the ability to think on the fly and to be aware of his own standpoint within the fight. He isn't self-contained in this little bubble and he's just throwing limbs at the opposition. He knows where he is in regards to the fight. There's this big argument right now about open scoring in MMA. He's scoring this fight as he's going. He's probably scoring it by strike. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think he's almost at that sort of granular level as he goes through rounds. And I think he knows when he lands, okay, that's a scoring shot. And he'll circle away, or I think he's almost at that level where he's operating on a different mental plane to a lot of his opposition. And I think his ability to control the narrative of a fight, that's why, and this is, saying he's a good game manager. Not every John Jones fight is that entertaining to watch. Right. You watch some of his past fights where he's won them with ease, but quite often you come away thinking, I wanted more. I wanted more out of that. I wanted to see more from Jones, but he does what he needs to do to win fights. I mean, I remember the Ovin St. Preux fight. I was there for that. He was very rusty in that fight, and he fought an Ovin St. Preux who had a broken arm for about 2.5, 3 rounds, I think. And he still didn't look particularly convincing, but he won the fight comfortably. Right. But he knows when to. He's like a great racehorse. He knows when to get 2-3 lengths clear and then maintain. And that's basically what he tries to do in most of his fights. That Gus fight was an interesting one because he was chasing. Yeah. Gus won the first couple of rounds, and it looked to me we were going back to the stall after each round, and it was like, okay, Jones lost that round, and then the second round, he's 2 rounds down. He needs every round from here on in, and that's when title fights get really interesting. Yes. When you've got a dominant champion who, I'm not saying the rounds were absolutely clear cut, but there was a relative consensus that Alex Gustafsson won round 1 and 2 in that fight.
Right.
You look at most people's scorecards when they've scored the fight to Jones, they've given him 3, 4, and 5. And I think the
Yes.
judge who scored 49, 46 might have given Jones the opening round because the first round was pretty tight. But yeah, so that was the other thing that made that Jones fight so interesting, because possibly for the only time in his MMA career, or certainly the only time that I can think of, he had to chase. He had to push the pace. Rather than let people come onto him, he had to go and win those last 3 rounds to keep his title. And he went and did it. And that's just another notch on his belt when you sort of list in the criteria why if he's not number one, then it's 1A, 1B with Mighty Mouse. You can sort of take your pick, really. But his ability to game manage and win any kind of fight is what stands him apart from the pack for me. And that was the perfect example of that.
Yeah, and that's also where most guys falter. If you're banking on, the athlete to or the overconfident guy or the one-shot knockout guy, once you get him out of that first round or whatever, once you get him into deep waters, whatever proverbial saying you want to throw in there, he passed that test and he wasn't even prepared for it. And which was the crazy stuff we learned in hindsight. We're going to go over someone who was prepared to go into the deep waters probably later on my list, but allow me to segue to number 3 as far as another classic. But before I segue, let me just say this one, John Jones versus Gustafsson, is not going to be on my list for this episode. Just understand that it deserves to be there and will be on there for the truncated version. I just know this one's you've covered this one as well as far as, interviewing the fighters and doing a VO piece, I believe, on Junkie Simon. So I had a feeling, in other words, that this was going to appear on your list, so I left it off, banking on my co-host, and he didn't let me down. So I'm going to go with another classic one. This one, it could either justify it as number 1, justify it as off the list, or a contrarian like me, you could give me crap for even having it on my list. But like, Dan, I thought you're better than this, man. You're supposed to be the dude that's like not picking the obvious stuff. I don't think anybody has that opinion, but whatever. Let's just say. But no, this one, I couldn't deny it, though. It's a classic one. And it's also a personal one for me as well, which is Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar 2. No, just kidding. One. Was this, though? No, we're not doing top 5 forgotten fights. That's a forgotten fight, right? Jeez. I think Fight Pass wasn't even carrying it up until recently. Like,
they're hoping to do it like Men in Black moment and just sort of shine the light and just forget that one ever happened. That was all fine.
I think so. But before I push on, was this on your list, Simon?
This was number 1. This was number 1. I mean, my number 1 and number 2, you could flip a coin. So I mean, this could have been my number 2. I went with number 1. I went largely because of the historical significance of this one. Put it over and above my number 2 selection, but you can make arguments either or. So I've got plenty on this. So you fire away, my man.
Let me set it up for you, like we're playing volleyball, and I'll serve it up to you, Simon, and you slam it home. All right.
You go for it.
Because mine is a lot of it's personal anyway, so your stuff will come in perfectly. But obviously, not to get too much into the historical, which my cleanup hitter will cover me there. Obviously, an important one historically. We all know the story as far as the UFC essentially gambling on themselves and the Fertittas at this time, and what that was. Of course, this wasn't actually the headliner. The headliner was Ken Shamrock versus Rich Franklin. They were banking on pulling back in an old name. They kind of reestablished. I mean, it's always been kind of a tenuous relationship, right? The UFC and Ken Shamrock. And as I'm watching this fight, by the way, Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar, just a side note, on one of the pillars, you see KenShamrock.com on there, and something tells me they would not normally go to bat as far as that first choice, because they already have Zions and things at this point. But in other words, I'm just doing a little inside baseball. I think that was definitely part of the inside deal to get Ken Shamrock to come back and lend his name. They let him blast the side of the octagon there with his name. But Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar are fighting in a venue here called the Cox Pavilion. Now I want to highlight this part of it because it doesn't get talked about, because it really shouldn't. It's kind of a side venue out by next to one of the casinos. It looks like a big backlot building, like it looks like a giant Costco that's empty. However, before mixed martial arts came to popularity, this was used for a lot of martial arts buildings. I grew up doing Taekwondo as a kid. I don't count any of the ranks or any things I earned there because I was a kid. I don't think kids should earn a black belt if you're under 18, but I did compete on the national level, and so I would travel all around. But when we went back to Vegas, a lot of the tournaments were there. Later, as I got older, my later teenage years toward adult years was Kempo Karate. And a lot of our tournaments, of course, they use the old Cox Pavilion again. So, I mean, this was, as far as a young Dan Tom going into martial arts and competing, there's a bit of a bias there, right? So now I've kind of moved past, again, like I talked about at the top of the show, I moved past the traditional martial arts part of my, martial arts experience into MMA. And I'm seeing these guys, because I'm a tough noob, by the way, folks. Like, I was aware of MMA in the late 90s and early 2000s, but I couldn't tell you who was who until about this time. It's about this time because I was a tough noob. I came in with all of the fans that once this matchup created, I came in with that. So when I'm watching this fight, and I'm not watching it live, mind you, I don't have a story where a friend called me. I'm sorry, I don't have that story, but I did watch it very shortly after and bought the DVD as soon as it came out. And I was just blown away. I'm falling in love with this new sport, Simon, called MMA. And I'm watching one of the most iconic fights, or what I didn't even realize how iconic it was at the time. And I'm seeing them do it in a place where I've thrown punches and kicks almost my whole life. And it really just fueled me in a slight different reason, but based off the same event as everybody else, and took me on this ride into MMA. So for that reason, I'd be remiss if it wasn't on my list. Absolutely deserving to be your number one. Take the steering wheel, sir.
I mean, I was just going to give you a very, very short history, or sort of a throwback into history. The thing that got me into MMA, I was on my stag party, bachelor party, as you would call them, over in the States. I was at a go-kart track, and me and the guys, we shouldn't have been anywhere near anything you should drive after the alcohol we'd drunk the night before, but I think there was more fumes coming off us than there were off the go-karts, but we were waiting for our turn on the circuit, and we're all suited up. We're standing there just waiting for the group ahead of us to finish, and there's a small portable color TV hanging on the wall, and it showed what looked like a flyweight against what looked like a heavyweight in some sort of white roped ring. And we were absolutely wrapped by this because there was this tiny little guy. He had like the Croatian flag on his shorts, and he's fighting this huge black dude. It was Bob Sapp versus Mirko Cro Cop, right? And we were like, well, okay, let's watch this guy get absolutely squashed. And Mirko hits him with a straight, I think he hammers him with a few body kicks, and then hits him with a straight left, and then breaks Bob Sapp's orbital bone, and he goes down and he's crying like a baby. That was my introduction to watching martial arts on TV. Gosh. We then, after my bachelor party and the massive hangover had subsided, I then discovered a TV channel in England called Bravo. And Bravo used to show, it was just started showing the UFC. And the first thing that they started to show was Tough One. And so I got in on the ground floor with Tough One. They were also showing, so it was Tough One and episodes of UFC Unleashed. And that's what we used to get.
Yes, I know that. So, I remember those days. Yes.
So I followed Tough One all the way through. Watched the entire series. It was on sort of the sort of time when you get home from the bar. You sort of get home from the pub on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and you're channel surfing. You think, oh right, there's that Ultimate Fighter thing. I'll put that on. And so I became hooked by that very quickly. And then obviously we got to the finale. So. I was already invested in most of the fights on the card. Having watched them all go through, I wanted to see Josh Koscheck get his head caved in by somebody,
right,
winding everybody up in the tough house. I wanted to see what crazy stuff Diego Sanchez would pull in the finale and all that sort of stuff. So then you get the see, most of the fights were pretty much blowouts. I think it was pretty much knockout finishes all the way through the card, which was great for TV. But they weren't all that competitive because there were guys on that tough first season. There were guys who were clearly ready for the move up, and there were other guys that clearly weren't. And that was kind of how that card was match made. I think there were a lot of guys who weren't quite ready, and it was a lot of one-sided fights early on in that card.
Yeah.
And then when we got to Griffin and Bonner, it was one of those where, having watched them go through, it was like, okay, this is going to be a proper fight because both of these guys are clearly nuts.
Yeah.
We watched their antics in the house. At some point, Forrest had dyed his hair ginger. At some point, I don't know who does that,
Shaved
but he
his head
did.
or something. Yeah,
He shaved. I
eating
think he dyed
bananas.
it ginger, and then I think he got like ginger shame or something, and decided I need to shave this off. So off it came. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, so we knew that we knew this was going to be a good fight, and then it didn't disappoint. They went in there and they threw down. And here's one for you. I don't know when you first watched it. I thought Stephan Bonner won that fight when I first watched the fight. I came like, when they were standing in the middle. Obviously, I'm not quite. I'm much more attuned to MMA scoring now than I was when I watched it then. But I remember watching it, and I know that they were scoring it 10-point must for every round. And I've been watching and writing about boxing for years before then, anyway. So watching that, and it was a largely striking-based matchup.
Right.
And I thought, okay, I think Stephan edged it. I think Stephan edged it 2-1 for a 29-28. So it ended up being unanimous decision for Forrest, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. But then you had that magic moment, didn't you, at the end where they called an audible, and it was like it's the sort of thing, if you put it in a movie, everyone would go, "Oh, that's corny. You can't do that. That's just you're going for the cheap pop and all the rest of it." Where they turned around and said, "Oh, we're going to give them both a contract," and Bruce Buffer's punching the air and all the rest of it. But that was exactly the right thing at that time.
Yes.
It just felt right, and all the sort of the legend of the deal being done in the car park afterwards. My understanding was that deal might already have been done, actually, and they were in the process of getting it ready, but it might not have been inked. So there might have been the final bit was being done out back, but yeah, I think just the sheer historical significance of that fight. Yeah, there've been better fights.
Right.
From a technical standpoint, that was a scrappy fight.
Right.
There was a scrappy fight, and I think both guys would probably look back at that fight and go, yeah, we probably weren't at our cleanest, slickest best in that fight. But they put on a hell of a fight.
I was still impressed. I was still impressed with the fight, though. I went back to watch it recently, and maybe my expectations were low because I was expecting exactly how you characterized it. But they're actually still doing some stuff in there where I'm like, hey, like I forgot how good of a transitionary fighter Forrest Griffin was. He's jack of all trades, master of none kind of guy. He really embodied that because even in early Forrest, I'm like, oh, I see why he was able to outwork guys he maybe shouldn't have, granted minus the knee surgery when he fought Shogun Rua. But you almost see how he gets these upsets over the Shoguns and the Rampages of the world, much less winning a fight that, to your defense, Forrest didn't think he won either.
Yeah, it was one of those. I mean, I just thought that Stephan, and I guess this is my inbuilt, everyone has a bias, whether they want to admit it or not, when they're looking at a fight. It's very hard to not go in with some form of bias, whether it's from stuff you've watched in the past
Absolutely.
or in fact you've seen more of one guy than another guy. But maybe it's because I watched a lot of striking-based fights in the past from watching so much boxing. But I thought Stephan was a lot crisper and a lot cleaner, and I thought his shots were a lot more solid. I thought Forrest, by comparison, his technique was more ragged. But Forrest was roughing him up as well. So, having gone back and watched it since, I haven't rescored it. I might have to rescore it under current rules and see whether it might turn out different. But imagine how different history might have been if Stephan Bonner had won that fight.
I was thinking
would they have done the same thing with the contracts? Would they have still? I assume they would have done.
See, that's tough because it's hard to know. I would have been curious on what it would have done to Forrest, more so because, even though he is still synonymous with the sport, still works at the UFC PI, he didn't seem like he really had a tough time walking away from this thing, Simon. And he didn't really seem like he had any too much flirtations of ever going back. And after a couple losses, like I know the Anderson Silva loss was really tough. He came back in the gym like weeks later and he was like almost 300 pounds. It was the heaviest he's probably ever gotten in his life. Like there was times where he almost stepped off before. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here with him being a cop and being, decently experienced more than people realized before that show. Like, yeah, does it affect maybe his trajectory more than Stephan's? I think Stephan pushes forward regardless. And I think if this fight was scored nowadays, I think first of all, I know people hate for whatever reason when you say, oh, should have been a split decision over a unanimous in any sort of context. But let me just say that if that fight gets judged under today's context, I do think it goes to a split decision. And I would not be surprised if Stephan takes it. Because I think, especially at that part of MMA, Go look no further than Diego Sanchez fights for like from that point to like 5 or 6 years after to when he fights Ross Pearson in New Mexico. Like MMA rewards the guy who goes forward, regardless if they're hitting air or not. Whereas Bonner was actually landing the more cleaner shots. Bonner was a boxing and taekwondo guy, so he was actually keeping range much better. However, he was choosing to fight on the outside of the octagon, which is still a dangerous proposition today, as we see with guys like Anthony Pettis, right? Another Taekwondo guy from that area. Nevertheless, I actually would, I kind of leaned when I was rewatching it. I'm like, I don't know, maybe I score it for Bonner the first 2 rounds. But Forrest, he has that strong rally in the third. But yeah, you could still argue that fight. It's so.
Yeah, you mentioned the Diego Ross Pearson fight, and I know you did that. Worst decisions or worst
we did stop.
worst
I don't think we
officiating?
did decisions yet, but that
was it worst
on there.
stoppages?
Yeah, but decisions,
yeah.
you're on the right track. That would be on there for sure.
Yeah, that for me was pretty dodgy. But I think back then as well with MMA, in reference to this light heavyweight fight, the Bonner versus Griffin fight.
Right.
The other thing you got to bear in mind is MMA as a sport hadn't been regulated for an enormous length of time by then. And the judges, a lot of them who were scoring these fights, in the majority of weekends, they're judging boxing matches, a lot of them. So, some of these guys are coming, they're judging boxing matches one weekend, and then they're coming in and they're doing MMA matches. And in boxing, forward pressure is quite a big factor when you're looking for a differentiating factor in a when scoring a boxing match, or at least it used to be. So, there's also that aspect as well. If the judges aren't quite as finely honed in terms of how in tune they are with the scoring criteria. If you talk to someone like Ben Cartledge, who's from my neck of the woods, from here in England, he's an outstanding judge. A, because he's consistent, but B, if you ever end up having a chat with him, he can explain everything perfectly. And like every time I'm at an event and he's judging, before every event we end up talking at Cage Side for like 20 minutes, and always end up putting ourselves behind time because we're chatting about the last fight where there was a iffy scoring decision or whatever, and we'd be talking through things. And he's great. He's great to listen to. I might have to get in touch with him and have a chat with him about a few things. But he's outstanding, and people like him are a really good reference point. But in those early days, us as fans and media members, I wasn't a media member at that point, but we were learning as we went as well. And the sport and even the fighters, fighters are more refined. They're sharper. Their skills are much more evolved and finely honed than they were back then. And that goes the same for everybody watching and everybody judging, scoring, officiating, everything.
Well, that was a deep dive on Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonner, but a well-deserved one, and that's well-deserved to end up at your number one. I apologize for sinking your battleship.
I might do the same for you in a minute with my number two. So
there we go. Well, how about on that note, just to make sure you don't run out of ammunition, I'll let you decide if you want to put something else in for a number one. We'll be an honorable mention by that time, anyways. But how about this? We'll just do a quick Chinese fire drill. I'll jump to my number two. You go to your number two, and then I'll finish on my number one, and you can either give another number one or just go in your honorable mentions on what almost made the list. I'll let you decide.
Cool.
All right. So, because you also touched on a note that, we're kind of surprised on sometimes, I mean, not just for this fight, the Griffin Bonner, but any fight when you're researching the list, sometimes you're surprised for better, sometimes you're surprised for worse as far as the level of fighting at that time. This one, I can almost guarantee, if you haven't gone back to watch this fight, folks, that if I told you to go back to UFC 22 and whatever kind of MMA you have in your head, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised to see that the level of fighting, particularly from Frank Shamrock, who was technically the UFC's first light heavyweight champion. Again, it was called the middleweight division when UFC went from openweight to deciding they wanted to do weight classes. They decided that 199, 200 pounds and below would be middleweight, and I believe you had guys like Jens Pulver when he was a godfather of the lightweight division. That lightweight division was actually like 170 and below. And like I said, they would eventually make lightweight at 155, which they called bantamweight for a brief portion until reshuffling the weight classes. But technically, the UFC's light heavyweight division dates back to 1997 in Ultimate Japan when Frank Shamrock submitted Kevin Jackson. He went on to defend his title 3 or 4 times um, till splitting ways with the UFC there, and that last fight was with Tito Ortiz. As far as that title run of him being technically, although they called it the middleweight, if we're going by what kind of Simon said, I'm going by the pride technicality here. Okay. This was an important fight also because the UFC, what would be known as its traditional 205-pound division, Tito Ortiz would, even though he lost this fight, he again, thankfully, we talked about what if certain fighters lost. Forrest Griffin, as great as he is, and I'm not trying to take a shot of his character, I was just there. That was genuine concern, conjecture. Like maybe his trajectory differs if he loses. Whereas Tito Ortiz, it's so, it's always in vogue to make fun of him for over a decade now. There's so many shots we could take. It's the cool thing to make fun of Tito Ortiz. And I'm not hating, by the way. Like, Bohachinya Depot, shouts to you, my dude. One of my favorite follows. I'm not hating on the fun, folks. I'm just saying, don't get it twisted. Tito Ortiz is a really important part of MMA history, UFC history, and light heavyweight history. He was a flag bearer, to pardon the pun. We all picture him with the flag back in the day, but he really did, especially through harder, arguable, dark periods, dark ages, as you hear them referred to. Tito Ortiz was the guy championing through these times. In fact, coming back to become champion later after this fight. So we make fun of Tito Ortiz, his confidence, his ego, his headstrongness, to put kindly. But you know what? It's a good thing he had that headstrongness, Simon, because he was able to learn from the lesson that Frank Shamrock gave him back at UFC 22. This was an amazing fight. First of all, back as far as, I was just, when I set this up talking about the level of fighting, you will be surprised. Frank Shamrock's throwing leg kicks, combinations. He's going to the body. He has takedowns, but when he's taken down or when he pulls guard, he does it meaningfully. Frank is immediately attacking. He's doing things like not just a bigger, musclier guy who's also flexible that can go for triangles, but when the triangle fails, he turns it into a leg lock. And if the leg lock fails, he uses the leg lock to create space and get back to his feet. I mean, these are techniques that guys were only starting to really pick up in modern MMA when you start seeing like the Matt Browns of the world face Johnny Hendricks, where it's like, okay, I'm not going to out wrestle you. You're bigger than stronger than me, just like Tito was bigger, stronger, a better wrestler than Frank. But if I can attack you with submissions, I can create space to get back into the fight. Matt Brown obviously did not win that UFC 185 bout against Johnny Hendricks, but I'm more talking about the technical evolution, and when we see guys doing stuff way ahead of the game, it's so impressive to me to watch Frank Shamrock do this. Secondly, it highlights something that I love, Simon, especially as a betting man. I love fighters like this archetype, and they're particularly fun to bet on, and especially if you like to bet on things live. It's risky to do in MMA. It's a gambit. It's a gamble. It's hard to do in MMA, Simon. But that is relying on your toughness and wits and you letting the other guy kind of blow out his steam. Now, me, I look young, but my body's been through a lot, so I grapple like a very old man. So this is my essentially game plan for everybody. It's, okay, shoot your shot, get your excitement out. I'm going to weather the storm. And as soon as you make a mistake or you start having to take breaths, that's where I'm going to step on the gas. The late Robert Follis, a coach of mine, had a great analogy for it. He taught his fighters. He also referred to something called putting down the pack. And I was able to go back and forth and kind of intellectualize with Robert on this and kind of add on to it with him. And what I love the most about picking up the pack, because Robert says every fighter is different. Some fighters can take a really heavy pack and they can run for really long distances and they can run longer and faster than you. They're better than you. But guess what? Eventually, they got to put that pack down, Simon. And as soon as they put the pack down, they usually do something like this. Right? You try for a submission, squeeze, 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 squeeze. You don't get it. And it's those little pockets, if you're smart. If you step on the gas in those pockets, you can get huge dividends. And Frank Shamrock teaches us all this lesson. As far as coming back late in this fight, and he purposely loses rounds early. He lets Tito Ortiz get top control. He lets Tito Ortiz escape submissions because Tito is expending energy. And Jeff Blacknick, who's an underrated commentator, he commentated wrestling. He was an acclaimed American wrestler. Okay, a great commentator. He's actually picking up on these things. He's explaining the action very well. And he's explaining what Frank is doing, and he's actually calling it. And sure enough, Frank's gamble works. By the 4th round, Tito is tired. He can barely go, and he loses by TKO. This is my number 2.
Yeah, and it's one of those great what ifs, isn't it? What if Frank had stayed in the UFC?
Yeah.
How would MMA history have changed? Because after that fight, Tito went on and fought Wanderlei Silva for the vacant title, won, and then went on that incredible run as light heavyweight champion. That may never have happened. It's one of those. It's a proper sliding doors moment in MMA history, because Frank and the UFC parted ways, and obviously we later saw Frank in Strikeforce. But Wanderlei Silva versus Tito Ortiz was next. Tito won that fight. He defended it, I think, 4 or 5 times, and then ran into Randy Couture, and you had that sort of triumvirate with Randy, Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, and that's when the golden age, or the first golden age of the UFC hit. That's when it really started to really resonate with the public, sort of stateside, and with the TV companies. Frank Shamrock sort of predated that, and arguably he could have stifled a lot of that, because for all of Tito's bombast and personality and everything that he brought to the table, Frank beat him. And quite often, I've got a theory when it comes to rematches. It's not a hard and fast theory, but quite often with rematches, I normally see that my sort of default position is, if guy A wins the first fight, the likelihood is guy A will win the second fight, and probably win it more handily, unless there is an obvious slip up or there's something else. But if one guy is clearly better than the other guy to start with, you assume the same rate of development between the 2 fights. Guy A should still be better for the second fight. And so a rematch would have been fascinating to see. Would it be an immediate rematch, or had Frank come back after a year or two, maybe solving whatever dispute he had at the time, and then coming back to maybe dethrone Tito? And we will, that whole light heavy, because back then, we talked earlier at the start of the show that the UFC light heavyweight division has sort of peaks and troughs, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's kind of
sure.
It's sort of peaks and valleys, and this was definitely just at the start of when that division started to peak. And I'm not saying Frank could have killed the light heavyweight division, but I think the history of that division could have been very different had he not parted ways with the UFC at that point. He
planted the seeds for it, certainly. And I would have loved to have seen it. I would have, despite being undersized against Tito, or like he would have been against a prime, depending on how you look at it, Chuck or Randy of those times, I still would have liked his chances. I think Randy would have given him the best fight. Randy dropping to 205 versus Frank there, but I still would have even took a undersized Frank Shamrock over a prime, quote unquote, Chuck Liddell. There's a lot of interesting things that could have happened if he would have stayed through that time period. So, and you're right; it's just super important. It launches us into the era forward, and I like that rematch note. I'm going to hold on to that, but I do agree with you on as far as this goes, how that would have gone. All right, Simon, I guess it's your adjusted number 1, but this is really your number 2. Obviously, your number 1 is Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonner. So what came in as your number 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can argue that they were 1A and 1B, and you can put them, you can rank them however you like. I mean, I've gone for Dan Henderson versus Mauricio Shogun Rua at UFC 139. I mean, this was a slam dunk pick for me. The only question for me was, do I put it at number 1 or not? Ultimately, I went for the historic angle. Maybe that's the writer in me. I love delving into the history of stuff, and I think that this fight, as good as it is, over time may gradually get forgotten about. Just over the course of time. Whereas I think Griffin Bonner, because of the historical significance, may stick around in the minds of people for a little bit longer. But if you're looking, and also you look at the Jones Gustafsson fight that we talked about earlier on, that was a technical chess match. It was a chess match with elbows, wasn't it? And it was a fantastic back and forth matchup. but it was a chess match. This was a knockdown, drag out, absolute slobber knocker of a fight. And different people tune in to watch fights for different reasons. But all of those people love nothing better than a good old fashioned tear up once in a while. You know, you can have your tactical battles, you can have your slick submission skills on the mat, but sometimes you just want a good old fashioned fight in a phone box to raise the old blood pressure and raise the heart rate. And that's exactly what these two delivered in San Jose, November 19th, 2011. Hendo won, unanimous decision, 48-47 on all three scorecards. And 5 of the hardest rounds you will ever see, like just in terms of the sheer amount of damage being dished out. I think the hardest fight I have ever watched in person, and it might even probably be ranked at the top of the list anyway, is Robbie Lawler versus Rory MacDonald at UFC 189. I mean, that for me, you know, that was almost beyond sport. There was something bigger going on in there. You know, that was just two human beings testing each other to see just how much they can take. This is in that vein. I think I wouldn't quite put it at that level. It's a gnat below that fight in terms of just the sheer amount of damage that was being dished out. And while obviously people like to focus on that and you know, the offense, the thing that I came away from and the reason why that's up there in the list is it's the heart of the fighters. You know, everybody who steps into a cage as a professional knows how to fight. They've all been taught how to throw a punch. They've all been taught how to defend takedowns. They've all been taught submissions, whether it's offensive, defensive. The basic tutoring of the skills to whatever level is in there. But what you can't teach people is heart. And you could have two people with identical skill sets. The guy with the bigger heart is probably going to win because they can take the fight to places that other fighters just won't go or can't go. You know, their body or their brain just won't allow them to break through that threshold where you say, okay, that's too much. For someone like Dan Henderson and Mauricio Shogun Rua, that line doesn't exist. And their ability to just fight through the pain barrier and put on the sort of show that we had at UFC 139. I think the fight's already in the Hall of Fame. I think it got put in a couple of years ago, and rightfully so. And Hendo started that fight like a house on fire, and it looked like he was going to finish the fight in the first 2 rounds. Shogun looked an absolute. He was going back to the stall a bloody mess. By the middle of that fight, it was like, you know, we're wondering if the corner might even stop it. It was getting that bad, and then Shogun found it within him. All those wars that he'd had in Pride, and even leading up to this one, it's like maybe he's had too many. Maybe this is one too many, you know. But somehow he came back in that fight, and he came storming back by the by the start of the 4th round. Henderson's gas tank was on red. By the end of the 4th round, he was running on fumes, and then in the 5th round, it was all Shogun as he was desperately trying to get a 10-8. And under today's scoring, I think he would have got it as well.
I think so too. And
the fight would have ended up a draw.
That's how I scored it.
In that case. So, but under that scoring, then
yes,
perhaps it was a little bit more borderline, and all the judges gave it a 10-9, which obviously wasn't quite enough for him, and he lost 48-47. But it's one of those fights that leaves you exhausted just as a spectator watching it, and it also makes you wonder what both fighters are thinking at the end of that, and how long it takes them to recover, not just physically but mentally. Those fights live with you. They have to. And I don't think, with the possible exception of Rory MacDonald and Robbie Lawler at UFC 189, possibly the most brutal fight I've ever watched. And I don't say that to glorify the violence of it. These are two supreme athletes prepared to push themselves beyond levels that anyone should ever have to push themselves in the field of sporting endeavor, if you like. It's that close. It was only the historical significance of Bonner Griffin that stopped this from being my number one.
I know what you mean. I went back and forth with this one too. This one, it's going to be on my truncated version of the list. I left it off to talk about a less popular Shogun fight, and also I had a feeling you were going to have it. And again, you didn't let me down. So So good. I took a gamble on not officially having this one on the list, but obviously it deserves to be there. You could have it as high as number one. And for better or worse, you're right. These guys really brought that limitation out of each other. And you're also right that people were already questioning if Shogun already had enough wars. Then, forget everything he did after. Keep in mind, folks, this was only the second or third 5-round non-title fight. The first one was Mark Munoz versus Chris Lieben that the UFC did. This was not very. Maybe the second one was maybe Poirier Zombie. Like, this was amongst the first 5. Okay, so it shouldn't have played an issue on the judging. More the time period did, like Simon said.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a weird kind of a fight too because we weren't used to it. So the fact that we have this crazy fight 3 rounds in, and what we get 2 more rounds, like you heard the excitement of Rogan, who was still calling non-pay-per-view events back then, right? And this was in San Jose, and when I went back to rewatch this, shout out to listeners Mindra, Mike, and Kendra, their beautiful family. I saw them right before the fight starts. They do the crowd pan. They're right there, and I'm like, hey, I know those guys, and so I wanted to shout them, listeners of the show. And this also took place on a night where one of my favorite MMA fights happened, which was Michael Chandler versus Eddie Alvarez 1, is happening the same night as this, by the way, which is like an insane. Talk about the MMA gods. It's like are they being good
both
to us?
On the same night.
Like, giving
That's
us both
madness.
those is insane. Like, to pick between... Thankfully, they didn't happen at the same time. I can't remember. You were able to digest both of them separately as far as the crossover came. But it was a fantastic fight, and it brought the best out of him, especially because this is both this fight and even their second meeting in the UFC. It's probably the last time you see Dan Henderson meaningfully use his wrestling in his career. He goes through stretches, even between both their fights, for this fight and their next fight. He really doesn't use it much. The reason is because now people who've been watching Shogun or other fellow analysts, this isn't a surprise to you, but Shogun is really a ground and pound fighter and a wrestler, folks. I say that kind of jokingly, but not really. We think about the soccer kicks. Well, how does he get them there? And the ground and pound finishes and pride and all those finishes. He was taking guys down with outside trips, body lock takedowns, using his athleticism, and he was taking guys down and beating them up. He still does that today as an old veteran because timing is one of those things. And for better or worse, as we saw through rounds 4 and 5 of this fight, Dan Henderson versus Shogun Rua 1, Shogun Rua can fight when he's compromised. That's how he's been able to fight for so long since this fight, because his prime has been long past. I mean, his knees were gone by the time he got to the UFC. We weren't seeing the top Shogun Rua, depending on who you ask. You know what I'm saying? So this was just an amazing example of that, and he's still able to, granted because Dan Henderson is fatigued at certain points, out-wrestle. Nobody takes down and out-wrestles Dan Henderson. I mean, for all the wrestling critiques you could be like of Dan Henderson not using his wrestling enough, like, the dude was a rock wall. Like, no one, aside from Daniel Cormier, was taking this guy down and manhandling Dan freaking Henderson. Yeah. So to see Shogun just, like, finishing the fight on mount, and they're lucky that Josh Rosenthal just let that ride out because it could have been, it could have been fuck all with the scorecards if they stop it. And that 5th round when he's mounted for, what was it? What do you have him mounted for? Like the last 3 minutes, Simon? It felt like in the round?
It was one of the, it was just constant. It was constant. But I mean, Henderson was doing just enough. He was moving around and he wasn't just a sitting duck getting smashed. He was at least defending himself. And also, it was at the end of a 5th round where, I mean, Shogun was knackered as well, but he wasn't quite as fatigued as Hendo was, so he was able to keep up a little bit of that. But I think if that had been in like round 2, I think we could have seen Rua sort of unload a hell of a lot more and maybe push for the stoppage. But at that point, the amount of punishment those two guys have been through it's a miracle they were both walking around at the end of the fight. It was an incredible piece of work by both of them. We talked at the start of the show about some of these fights leave the fighters changed afterwards,
yes.
and this was the perfect example of that. And
yes.
We've seen Hendo defied his years for quite a while after that. I mean, talk about brutal knockouts. His knockout of Hector Lombard at UFC 199 is one of the most brutal knockouts I've ever seen live.
Oh, jeez.
It was like a back elbow, kind of like that, and then he just absolutely smashed him on the floor with forearms and elbows, and that was past the age of 40 as well, I think. And he's been around and doing it for so long. Shogun's been in there and has been fighting against absolute killers for his entire career. But that one was a special one. I think
Yeah,
both guys, if you sat them down, they'd both say, "Yeah, that was a good one."
I don't know what's more insane, that Shogun was only 29 or that Dan was 41 when this fight happened. But speaking of spinning stuff, and speaking of rematches, and speaking of Dan freaking Henderson, and speaking of number ones with historical importance kind of just edging this fight out, right, Simon? It's a perfect segue to my number one, if I may.
Go for it.
And this one has Dan Henderson, but the difference is having Dan Henderson winning is he gets the finish too, which is the one thing. And again, we're splitting hairs. It's an amazing fight, but if we got to split hairs on the list, this one gets a finish, and it's got the historical importance. I knew it was going to be on this list because it's one of my favorite fights of all time, off one of my favorite cards of all time. So why not put it number one? And that's Pride 33. Dan Henderson defeats Wanderlei Silva in the rematch. He lost the first one. Wanderlei Silva, granted, he was coming off of a knockout loss, so he was fighting a little more defensive, whereas Dan Henderson, who was fighting on a conservative run prior to that, was fighting much more offensive. In fact, a seldom spinning blow that Simon just referenced against Hector Lombard, probably the only other significant one we really saw Dan Henderson hit, was the spinning back fist before the knockout blow against Wanderlei Silva here. Of course, Wanderlei Silva, I think it was, what was it, seven years as Pride middleweight, which of course qualifies for light heavyweight, as we've covered on this program. Yep. You know, granted, there's some trickiness with some non-title fights and some decisions there. Aside from that, Wanderlei Silva owned this division. After, like you said, he loses early to Vitor Belfort and Tito Ortiz, but he puts that part of his career behind. He is the axe murderer, right? And this is Las Vegas. You got Chuck Norris. You got Nicolas Cage in the audience. A who's who celebrity, right? You got Frank Trigg, who just fought the prior on the card. Now all of a sudden he's changing into his monkey suit. He's calling the fight with Josh Barnett. Like, it's insane, right? And it's a good fight. It really is. You see Wanderlei's ground game. You see some of his underrated grappling. We see Wanderlei Silva, despite getting knocked out with a left hook, he actually rocks and almost finishes Dan Henderson with a left hook at the end of round one. What's interesting about that is that most of the Pride rounds were 10-minute rounds, correct? Well, Pride 33, folks, was the first, or one of the first, I should say, Vegas fights. So they were running under the Nevada State Athletic Commission, who would not allow those rounds. So this was a 5-minute first round, and at the end of the adjusted 5-minute first round, Dan Henderson is like out on his feet. He's doing the thing where he's smiling, which most people do. They smile when they're hurt. Dan Henderson doesn't do that. Like, you knew Dan Henderson was hurt because he probably didn't realize he was smiling, because Dan Henderson goes to the wrong corner, which makes you wonder that what would have happened if this was the traditional Pride round. You know, does Dan Henderson, does he maybe survive, but he just ends up kind of on that downhill losing trend that he was when he first fought Wanderlei? But nope, yeah. Dan Henderson gets saved by the bell, and he breaks that trend that Simon referenced that tends to happen with rematches, because this isn't a washed-up Wanderlei Silva. I mean, Wanderlei Silva's on all the supplements at this time, folks. He's thick. I mean, these guys are both pretty thick, but let's not go there. It's a great fight. And Dan Henderson, of course, is one of the best exchanges. It was on my top 5 hook KOs, because it's where you miss the right hand and you know that left hook's coming. And Wanderlei Silva, just like Fabricio Verdum against Stipe Miocic, and a lot of these guys do, where they lose their title because of a pride game. And I think you mentioned another example earlier where someone gets hit and they want to get it back, right? They want to get it back. And Wanderlei wanted to get back that spinning back fist. He stayed in the pocket too long. And Dan Henderson hits him with his left hand, which is my most favorite thing about the finish. Everyone knows Dan Henderson for the H-bomb, the right hand. But yeah. Gets him with the left hook. Before Wanderlei even wakes up, you've got confetti coming down. Dun, 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 dun. The Pride music, right? It's great. It's classic. I mean, you don't get that even anymore in MMA, and it's amazing. Maybe it's because I miss people, because we're not around people, all the social distancing, Simon. But it's an amazing scene at the end of the fight that does nothing to do with the fight. But God damn it, this is my number one.
Yeah, it was a classic KO. I mean, for Wanderlei Silva is a legend, and his career will stand the test of time as someone who fought during the real golden era in Japan, and then moved across and fought in the States, fought for the UFC, and had some semblance of success in the UFC towards the latter end of his career before eventually eventually age, old father time eventually caught up with him in the end. But he's also known for being on the wrong end of two of the most devastating knockouts in MMA history. I mean, there was that left head kick from hell from Mirko Krokop, which is probably the greatest head kick knockout in MMA history.
Yep.
And then you've got that huge left hook from Dan Henderson, which if you watch that knockout back, I think he caught Vanderlei basically standing completely square onto him, which is not a place you need. You really want to be standing. You always want to be slightly one shoulder ahead. You never want to be squared up like that. And because you've got nowhere to go. And when you're squared up like that and you've got nowhere to go and you're facing someone with a punch power of Dan Henderson, that's a really dangerous place to be. And he absolutely finished him off with it with a huge left hook. I've got to say, I miss Pride. I miss Pride. Yeah. I want, great point about the 5-minute opening round in Vegas. Again, I think we'd have seen a different result. I don't think Hendo would have won that fight with a 10-minute first round. And, mentioning sort of supplements and saying their prayers and taking their vitamins and all that, like they all seem to do over there during the Pride era. The 10-minute round really did sort out the those that were on the good stuff and those that perhaps weren't. Because being able to fight an absolute professional savage for 5 minutes in a ring, in virtually no holds barred contest, is bad enough. But 10 minutes, you could kill a guy in 10 minutes if you weren't fully trained, So
sorry, I was going to say, I remember that arms race, by the way, as far as the supplements goes. Like, you even hear the commentary acknowledging it. Like, for a second, when they talked about Brazilian top team, they'd be like, oh, yeah, don't forget, he's a Brazilian top team guy. And those guys have figured out their cardio. Yeah, they come in very prepared. And, like, I was like...
Figured out their cardio.
Like, what are they doing down there that everybody else is doing, guys? Out with it.
Yeah, no, it's well, I think what was it the contract said? I think the contract said you will not be drug tested.
Absolutely.
I think that's basically, it didn't say don't take drugs or you can take drugs. It was just to let you know, guys, no drug testing here. And it was like, okay, open door, we'll just let you crack on. And I mean, I absolutely do not condone it, but it made for some incredible spectacles over the years. And yeah, I mean, those guys, I guess they all knew what they were getting into, but we had some spectacular stuff down the years in the Pride era. And it's a shame because that Pride event in Vegas, that was pretty much the tail end of Pride, wasn't it? It wasn't that much longer after that they sort of fell into financial issues and ended up, the UFC ended up purchasing them.
That same year, yeah.
The deal might even have been done while they were over that week. You just don't know.
Yeah, you know what? That is very true. Simon, we got 10 minutes left to knock out honorable mentions and listener list. But before I get to the listener list, I feel like I robbed you of a number one. So was there one that almost made the list that could stead here, that was just so close that you hated leaving off?
I've got 4 here, and cool. I think some of them are controversial insofar as some of them have no place on this list whatsoever, but they're worth mentioning from a personal point of view. They're all notable. I'll do them in chronological order, oldest first.
Cool.
Vitor Belfort versus Vanderlei Silva, UFC Brazil, classic. Or UFC 17.5, as it was known.
When they did the .5s.
The old .5s. Nothing like having half an event extra when you need it. October 16th, 1998. Vitor Belfort, wearing wrestling shoes, absolutely destroys Vanderlei Silva with what can best be described as an absolute salvo of punches. Literally runs across the cage like he's controlled by some kid with a video game controller. Yes. And just absolutely destroys him in 44 seconds, I think it was. That was worth mentioning. I didn't include it because he was fighting at 199, and I didn't want to blur my lines too much, but that's worth a mention. Vanderlei Silva gets another mention. Brian Stan versus Vanderlei Silva.
Great
UFC
fight.
On Fuel TV 8 in Saitama, Japan. Up until not that long ago, referee Mark Goddard said that was the greatest fight he ever officiated. He was the man in the middle for that fight. Yep. But he's since refereed Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum. So now he has a new number one. So, which I think is fair enough. But that's Stan Vanderlei Silva. The last fight we ever saw Brian Stan inside the octagon, and He obviously went on to be a valuable resource to the UFC as an
Yep.
analyst. And I think we still miss him. I'd love to see Stan back. I know he's off doing other things. I think he might have a shareholding in is it real estate he's working in now?
Yes, I believe so.
I
Yeah.
think he's got a holding in a real estate company. So, but yeah, I always had a lot of time for Brian Stan. That was an incredible fight. Vanderlei took that on home soil, if you like,
Yeah.
inside Tama,
Yeah.
and one that would never make the list, but I want to mention it just because I was there. It is the latest finish in UFC light heavyweight history, the biggest comeback in UFC light heavyweight history. It happened right in front of my very eyes. I was literally feet from it when it happened. UFC London 2018, or UFC Fight Night 127, March 17th, 2018. Scotland's Paul Craig,
Yep.
the Bear Jew himself, against Magomed Ankalaev. Mark my words, Magomed Ankalaev will fight for the UFC light heavyweight title within the next 24 months. He's that good. He's beginning to prove it. His career's had a couple of little roadblocks, but he's only ever lost one fight, Dan. And this was the fight. And he only lost 1 second of that fight. He absolutely dominated Paul Craig through all of round one, through all of round two, and for 4 minutes and 55 seconds, I would say, of the third round. It was all Ankalaev. Like, Craig was trapped against the fence on his back, getting absolutely smashed. Ankalaev throws his legs up. Craig throws his legs up. Triangle arm bar. Ankalaev taps at 4:59. Finished. Incredible. So I had to mention that. And the last one, Onglaran Song versus Ken Hasegawa at One Championship Spirit of a Warrior. If you want a really up-to-date one, find that fight online. I'm pretty sure that One Championship will have put it on their YouTube channel.
I think
They put a load of their fights on there. That's an absolute barnstormer of a fight. Maybe not right up to the level of some of the fights we've talked about on this list from a stature standpoint, but Onglaran Song is an absolute savage. He's another guy who's got that ability to fight through anything and everything. And him against Ken Hasegawa, who was, I think he was either Pancrase open weight champion. I think he might be the Pancrase or the deep open weight champion. That was an incredible fight. And it finished with like a fifth round knockout uppercut. Huge KO. That's well worth digging out as well. So they're my 4 honourable mentions.
I like that you got that in there too. That's a good one. And as far as that Paul Craig selection, who doesn't like Paul Craig? And I don't disagree with the Ankalaev, man. Southpaw is a heavy-handed southpaw at that weight. All right. Again, follow the podcast at the PYM Podcast to contribute to the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Real easy to remember. Jordan at JYork87, who's co-hosted this here show before. His list is Griffin Bonner. Great choice. We covered that one. Jones Gus also on our list. Hendo Shogun 1 on our list. Chuck versus Vanderlei. I mean, you want to talk about a build-up, and there wasn't a finish, but it was still a really good fight.
Yeah, it's cracker.
And then personal pick, Machida Rashad. Hey, we had that same personal pick, Jordan. My man. He also says, honorable mention, any Sean O'Connell fight. And I'll just throw out there, Sean O'Connell versus Steve Bosse, and Sean O'Connell versus Vinny Magalhaes.
The Steve Bosse fight, I remember that. It was one of those where you're just watching it on the TV going, this is insane. Yes. These two guys, it was just insanity. How they were standing, taking those shots. Yeah, absolute insanity. But yeah, I remember that fight. And Sean O'Connell obviously has gone on and he's doing a great job over there with the PFL now, play-by-play.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of Sean O'Connell as well. It's another guy I can't help but root for. Benny Abs at Benjamin Abrigo on Twitter. Over there from Fansided. He's got Hendo Shogun 1. Classic. Gotta have that. He's with me on the Tito and Frank. Awesome. He's got Vanderlei and Rampage 2. I love that finish more. That's the one where it's the knees and he's just hanging there. I believe that one. What was that one? Was that the Halloween 2004 one? Was that the first time?
Yeah.
Or
is that the one where he sort of fell on, his head was sort of hanging on the ropes a bit, wasn't it? If I remember rightly.
I believe that's the Halloween day back at, is it Shockwave 04? It's in 04. I always get confused. He has Shogun versus Nogueira, and that's going to be on my honorable mention. That almost made the list, Simon. That was a close one for me when we do the truncated version on Junkie. you can count. You'll see that one. That's a good hardcore one to go watch, folks. I recently went back to watch it when I was doing that little half guard dive, and you see some of Little Nog's half guard in that game. You see a lot of just real awesome MMA things as far as just, you really see the game pick up as far as level. We see a lot of themes, a lot of scenarios and exchanges that would repeat itself throughout the golden eras of MMA. As far as things on the technical side, we see it in that fight, very technical. And again, which shouldn't be a surprise. A talented southpaw boxer like Little Nog was getting the better of the exchanges for the most part, but Shogun was getting the takedowns, ground and pound, and also just really getting emphatic moments at the end of rounds, which were saving his butt. So he got a unanimous decision win. Spoiler alert, but it's a very close and competitive fight, worth rewatching. He also has Jones Gustafson. Of course, we can't argue that, right?
Yeah.
Of course, my man Iceman Winhoff, who I'm going to get on here as a co-host at Brass Chuck from the MMA Analysis podcast. He's, of course, giving my man Benny some crap. He was talking about Jones Gus being criminally overrated, but of course we kind of covered that and also discussed why why that's fair if you want to take that stance, but also why why it's also a great fight still that stands the test of time. So a lot of opinions on that fight, which I find interesting, which is cool. But here's Brass Chuck's list, okay? He says, I tried to make a list mixing the top 5 bests and the top 5 biggest, but there were too many. Hipster pick, Manhoff versus Cyborg 1. That is a hipster pick for sure. I was looking at some Melvin Manhoff earlier. I think I referenced it off the top of the show, but he also fought at middleweight as well, so you got to be careful which one you pick. That's a good one. He also has Vanderlei Stan, which we just covered. Mark Goddard, yep, that's right. He was reffing that one. Tito versus Ken 1. Wow, Tito versus Ken 1. Okay, that was the best one of their trilogy. So yeah, I remember. I'm pretty sure it's Tito versus Ken 1. Where this is what I love about Big John McCarthy, because especially in the early days where he just seemed like this ruthless, unthinking cop that would just beat you and beat everybody that he pulled over. Like when people just kind of had that image of him, like. He really knew how to placate to tough men's egos as well. He could be that caring guy if you watched. Like when he saves BJ Penn from Matt Hughes after the first TKO loss, and he does the same thing to when he saves Frank Shamrock from Tito Ortiz, I believe, in that fight. Brad, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But he stops and he goes, "You're a tough motherfucker, Ken. You're a tough mother." And he's playing to his ego, making him feel better. Because he knows he's not going to be happy that he got his ass kicked and the fight stopped. But, I don't know. That stoppage always just burns in my head for that one. He has Shogun versus Little Nog, which we just covered, and Hendo versus Shogun 1. His honorable mentions, Frank Tito, Chuck Tito, Vanderlei Rampage 2, and Basse O'Connell. Any comments on any of those, Simon?
I mean, this just demonstrates how many amazing fights there were at that light heavyweight division over the years. I mean, any of these lists could be held up as a completely legitimate list, and I think it's down to personal preference and how you go about ranking these things. We talked about the criteria. The best thing for these criteria is for it to be open. I mean, you remember when we did the Fighters of the Decade for MMA Junkie?
Yeah.
And Simon Samano said to us, the criteria is entirely yours. All I want is your was it your top 10? I think it was, or top 15. And I don't care how you get to it. If that's your top 10, that's your top 10. You go out and rank them in whatever way you see fit for yourself. And because of that, we had a wide-ranging set of selections, which made it particularly interesting when the fight, when those fighters were eventually announced in order. And I think it's the same with this. People like different things about watching fights. Some people just want to see two people beating the snot out of each other, and then there's other people who want the sense of occasion. They want it to be for a title. They want it to be in a big arena, or they want an underdog story, or they want a comeback, or there's so many different angles you can take for this, and there's no wrong answers, because if they're your favorite 5 fights, they're your favorite 5 fights.
Exactly.
Then and no one can tell you you're wrong, because they're your picks. And there isn't a fight there. I mean, even my Paul Craig Ankalaev pick, which from a stature, quality, historic standpoint, probably it doesn't stand up against anything else that we've mentioned. but it was relevant to me as an honourable mention because literally I could almost have reached out and touched Paul Craig's head before he threw the legs up for the triangle. Right, he was right in front of me, and the fact that it was so late and literally no one saw that thing coming. And because of that, that sticks in my head. It resonates with me. So that goes on my honourable mentions list.
It'll stand the test of time. That's for sure, Simon. So let me just get one last honorable mention list in here. I forgot. I'm trying to advertise more on Instagram. So I'd feel bad if I don't give a shout to Accelerated Athletics, who said Jones versus DC, Jones versus Gustafson, DC versus Johnson, DC versus Silva. I think he's a DC fan, but thank you for the contributing, and Machida versus Couture. Oh, that was a tough one. I watched Randy Couture get knocked out in Extreme Couture.
The Karate Kid.
Yeah, because it was up in Canada, so everybody, we're going to support Randy, and we all pile into the gym. There's like 20 TVs there. The second part of the gym's already open. Holy crap! It must have been it was like a clearly smaller version of what it must have been like in Brazil when Fabricio got knocked out by Stipe and everybody just went quiet. That was the gym. That was the gym for that one. But not to rush us out of here, but we are out of time, Simon. Man, this was awesome. We covered a lot. We haven't done a 2-hour episode in a while, but it was well worth it for this topic, and I'm glad I had you to unpack it with me. Thank you very much, man.
Appreciate being on. I love getting on and talking fights. So, and when there's so many great ones to talk about, it's not hard work, is it? It's easy getting on and doing stuff like this. So continued success to you, my man. And hope this one goes over well.
Thank you. Anything to plug before we get out of here? Twitter address, anything at all?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Simon Head. I am on Instagram at Simon Head Sport. And stay tuned. There may be a little bit of podcast-related news coming from me in the not too distant future, but I'll keep that under my hat for now.
All right, I'll be looking out for that. Thank you guys for listening. Again, you can follow me at Dan Tom MMA at the PYN Podcast on all social platforms. And to support the podcast, you can go to mixedmartialanalyst.com. That's where you can find smartphone-friendly players. I'm going to get us on the Stitcher and the rest of them as well, not just on iTunes. Of course, we just started a YouTube episode where a video version of this, if you're not already watching it, hello, will be up. Please subscribe to my channel. I got to figure out what to do one of those bit.lys, because right now I just have the, www.youtube.com until I get like a certain amount of followers, then it allows me rights. So you guys can just honestly, the best way to help the show is hitting subscribe. I won't spam your feeds. Sharing the podcast, those are all free. Or if you are going to spend money, you don't even got to spend money on the show, but everybody's shopping at Amazon, which I feel terrible advertising because I kind of hate Jeff Bezos and the brass and what they're doing. Another episode not here. But if you're going to do some shopping there at Amazon or at Onnit, they've got great hemp protein, vitamin C to stay healthy this time. Go to mixedmartialanalyst.com. We have all the banners to the right. You just click through the banner. It's an extra click or two. You're off doing your shopping. It takes no extra charge from you. Just kicks a small percentage of the show back to this shit show. And like I got new lights for this show. We'll have a new camera set up the next one. We'll keep it coming thanks to you guys. I will do my part by trying to continue to provide content for free. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Simon, thank you for being on. Support my guests as well. They're not just on here because they're good guests. They're good people who do good work. So until next time, always, you know the drill. Protect your neck.